I want to start by saying this out loud because I think it matters. You don't need to feel ready to listen to this. You don't need to feel calm. You don't need to feel spiritual, and you don't need to feel like you're doing grief right. And I say that in quotations. If you're here, that's enough. I think a lot of people assume they need to be in the right headspace to listen to something like this. Like grief work is something that you actually prepare for or schedule or enter when you're regulated. But the truth is, most of us find these spaces when we're not okay, when something feels off, when life just doesn't look the way it used to, when we're functioning, or barely. So wherever you are right now, driving, walking, lying awake, disassociating a little, you don't need to change anything. Just let this be here with you. My name is Kimberley. I'm an intuitive grief guide, death doula, and licensed esthetician. And whether I wanted to be or not, I'm a lifelong student of grief. When I say I'm a lifelong student of grief, I want to be really clear about what I mean. Because this isn't something that I just woke up one day and chose like a career. This wasn't a calling I went looking for. It came through lived experience. Grief has been something that I've had to learn how to live with at so many different stages of my life, not just one moment, not just one loss. It's shown up in different forms, different layers, different seasons. And every time I thought I understood it, something shifted and I had to learn it all over again. So when I say student, I mean that grief keeps teaching me. Teaches me about my body, what I can tolerate, what I can't anymore. Teaches me about my relationships, who can sit with discomfort and who can't. It teaches me about time and how it doesn't actually heal the things we're told it does. Because I've learned that grief doesn't move in a straight line. Comes back around in completely unexpected ways in your skin, your nervous system, in your reactions to things that maybe never even bothered you before. And it doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong. It means that grief is alive. Being a lifelong student of grief also means I don't pretend to have it figured out. I don't believe in mastering grief or completing it or graduating from it. I believe in learning how to carry it differently, more honestly, and with less resistance over time. And I think a lot of us are already students of grief, whether we realize it or not. We just weren't given language for it. We were taught to be strong, to move on, to not talk about it too much. But grief keeps showing up anyways, because love doesn't disappear just because someone does. So when I say I'm a lifelong student of grief, what I really mean is this. I'm still learning how to live with what I've loved. I'm still learning how to listen to my body when it reacts. I'm still learning how to make space instead of rushing myself, and sacred arc is part of that learning. Not because I'm done, but because I'm willing to stay present with it. Sacred arc is not a podcast about healing in the way that we usually hear that word. It's not about moving on. It's not about closure. It's not about getting back to who you were before. Because a lot of us don't get to go back. Something happens, a death, a diagnosis, a rupture, a slow loss, and the person that you were before no longer exists in the same way. And yet, the world keeps expecting you to perform as if nothing changed. I think one of the hardest parts about grief, and this doesn't get talked about enough, is how quickly it becomes invisible. At first, there's the understanding you're not okay. People check in. They give you space. They lower their expectations, and then time passes. And without anyone saying it out loud, there's this quiet assumption that you should be better now. Not because you're actually better, but because you're functional. You're back at work. You're answering emails. You're showing up. So people read that as healing. But functioning isn't the same thing as being okay. It just means you learned how to move again, even if something inside of you is still very tender. I have come to learn that grief has a very public phase and then a very private one. The public phase is the one that gets the support, but the private phase is where people struggle alone. You see it at work a lot. At first, people are careful with you. They don't know what to say. They give condolences, casseroles. And then a few months later, it's business as usual. Deadlines don't change. Expectations don't change. And suddenly you're sitting there in a meeting thinking, I'm here, but I'm just not really here. The holidays are another big one. The first year, people expect it to be hard. The second year, less so. But by the third year, it's almost like it's supposed to be normal again. But holidays don't forget. They highlight absence. They bring back memories. They remind you of what's missing, even if everyone else is celebrating like nothing happened. Socially, it gets strange. People don't even know whether to ask anymore. They don't want to bring it up, so they don't. And suddenly, something that completely changed your life becomes this thing that you carry silently because it feels awkward to name it after a certain amount of time has passed. That's part of why grief feels so lonely later on. Not because it gets smaller, but because it stops being seen. And I think a lot of people start questioning themselves at that point. Why am I still feeling this? Why can't I just move on? Or what's wrong with me? But I want you to know there is nothing wrong with you. Grief didn't disappear, it just went underground. And that invisible phase, that's often the hardest one. Sacred Arc exists for people living in that in-between. The space where you're still here, still showing up, still doing the things, but quietly, internally, something is just different. You might feel more sensitive, more reactive, more tired in ways that sleep doesn't fix, less tolerant of small talk, less patient with the BS, and maybe you don't even know why. When I talk about the in-between, I'm talking about this stage that feels extremely confusing because it doesn't really look like crisis anymore. From the outside, things look okay. I'm functioning, I'm working, doing what I need to do. So even sometimes I catch myself thinking, why does this still feel so hard? The in-between is when you're no longer falling apart, but you're also not who you were before. And that is an extremely disorienting place to live. For me, grief has changed my tolerance in ways I never expected. My capacity is different now. Things that used to feel manageable, social plans, family gatherings, even certain conversations, they just take so much more energy than they used to. And it's not because I'm fragile. It's because my nervous system has been through something it doesn't forget. I notice it in really specific ways. Small talk drains me faster. I feel overwhelmed more easily, not emotionally dramatic, just done. And when I push past that, my body lets me know. Shows up as a tight chest, shallow breathing, irritability that feels out of proportion. It's not weakness, it's my nervous system saying this is too much. The in-between is also where boundaries start to matter, and that can be extremely uncomfortable. There are things I used to say yes to that I just can't anymore. Not because I don't care, not because I'm angry. I just don't have the capacity to override myself the way I used to. I think this is the stage, at least for me, that's especially confusing because people stop checking in on you here. You're not in crisis anymore, you're not visibly breaking down, so the support fades. Right at the moment when you're trying to rebuild your life around a version of yourself that you didn't choose. And internally, it can still feel like this quiet question keeps coming up. Why do I still feel different? The answer isn't that something is wrong, it's just that grief didn't just happen to you, it reorganized you. Your priorities shift, your tolerance shifts, your sense of safety completely shifts, and that takes time to understand. The in-between is where you start realizing you can't go back, but you don't yet know how to move forward in a way that feels true. It's not dramatic grief, it's not constant sadness. It's this steady underlying awareness that life is different now and so are you. And I think a lot of people get stuck here, not because they're doing something wrong, but because no one ever told them that this stage exists. No one told us that grief doesn't end, it evolves. And the in-between is where that evolution starts to show up in the body, in relationships, and how you move through the world. This podcast is for people who have thought things like, I don't know what's wrong with me. I should be past this by now. Other people have it worse. I don't even know if this counts as grief. If you've had those thoughts, I want you to hear this clearly. Grief doesn't require permission. It doesn't require comparison, and it doesn't follow a timeline. One of the quickest ways people silence their own grief is through comparison. It usually sounds something like other people have it worse. And I understand completely why we do that. It feels like a way for us to stay humble. Feels like a way for us to not take up too much space or to protect other people from our pain. But comparison doesn't actually make grief smaller. It just makes it lonelier. There's another version of comparison grief that shows up a lot, and it doesn't sound spiritual. It just sounds complimentary, if you will. It's when people say things like, you must be really strong, or I don't know how you do it, or I could never survive something like that. And again, I know that's usually meant as kindness, but the impact can be very different. Because when someone says that, what it can quietly imply is, you're handling this. You've got this. You don't need support. And suddenly there's no room left for you to say, actually, I'm not okay. Being labeled strong can feel like a role that you didn't agree to play. It can feel like pressure to keep functioning, to keep showing up, to not inconvenience other people with your pain. And over time, that makes grief even more isolating. Because strength gets confused with capacity. But just because you're still standing doesn't mean this isn't heavy. Just because you're functioning doesn't mean you're not struggling. And just because you're surviving doesn't mean you're okay. I think a lot of people stop reaching out because they don't want to disappoint the version of them that others have decided exists. If you're strong, you don't get to fall apart. If you're resilient, you don't get to ask for help. If you're handling it, you don't get that space to say it still hurts. And then comparison sneaks in again. You start thinking, other people couldn't handle this, so I should be able to. Or I don't have the right to complain if I'm still functioning. But that's not strength, that's silence. Real support doesn't require you to be strong. It requires you to be honest. And grief does not need you to prove how capable you are. It needs room. It needs compassion. It needs permission to exist without being ranked or reframed. You don't owe one single person a performance of strength. You are allowed to need support even if you've survived a lot, and especially then. When we compare our grief to someone else's, we start minimizing what we're carrying. We tell ourselves things like, I should be grateful. I shouldn't complain. I don't have a right to feel this bad. And over time, that turns into silence. I see this a lot. I've done it myself. People will say, at least. At least you had time. At least you had support. At least it wasn't sudden. But grief doesn't work in at least, and there's no hierarchy of pain. Loss is loss. Comparison grief also creates isolation because it teaches us not to speak. If we believe our pain doesn't qualify, we stop reaching out. We stop naming what hurts. We stop letting ourselves be seen, and then we wonder why we feel so alone. The truth is, grief isn't a competition. Your pain doesn't take anything away from someone else's. It doesn't need to be justified or earned. Grief just exists because love existed. That's it. I honestly think comparison is one of the ways that we try to stay in control. If we rank our pain, maybe we can manage it. Maybe we can make sense of it. Maybe we can convince ourselves we're doing okay. But what actually happens is we abandon ourselves right when we need compassion the most. And comparison doesn't come from the inside. It's reinforced socially. People don't know what to say, so they say things that unintentionally minimize. They point out silver linings. They try to make it better. They remind you of other people's losses. And while the intention might be care, the impact is often isolation. When you tell yourself that others have it worse, you're not being strong. You're being alone. And grief is already isolating enough. You don't need to do that to yourself. One of the most compassionate things you can do is let your grief exist without comparison. To say, this hurts. And that's enough. You are allowed to take up space with your pain, even if someone else's looks different. I'm going to say that again. You are allowed to take up space with your pain, even if someone else's looks different, and especially then. Sacred Arc is for people who are tired of being told they're strong. Strong has become one of the most dismissive words we use. When someone says, "You're so strong," what they often mean is, "I don't know what to do with your pain, and I need to believe you're okay." But strength is not the absence of pain, and resilience is not the same thing as being unaffected. The name Sacred Arc matters to me because an arc is not linear. It bends, it rises, it falls. Some days you feel grounded. Some days you feel completely wrecked. Some days you think you're doing better, and then something small takes you right back. That doesn't mean you're failing. It means you're human. I think all of this is really why Sacred Arc needed to exist, because I didn't see many spaces that allowed grief to be what it actually is. Layered, ongoing, physical, deeply human, without trying to clean it up. So often, grief spaces feel like they're asking you to get somewhere, to heal, to transform, to find meaning, to come out on the other side wiser or stronger or more spiritual, and sometimes that's just not where you are. I needed a space that didn't rush grief. A space that didn't ask people to turn pain into a lesson right away. A space that didn't require you to be inspirational or resilient or okay. Because not all grief becomes wisdom, at least not on a timeline. Some grief just becomes part of who you are. Sacred Arc exists because grief doesn't only live in the mind. It lives in the body, lives in the nervous system, in the skin, in how safe the world feels afterward. And I don't think we talk enough about that. We treat wellness like it exists in a separate category. Like you can meditate your way out of loss, or skincare your way out of stress, or mindset your way out of nervous system overwhelm. But the body remembers. This space exists to talk about all of that together. Not grief over here and wellness over there, not spirituality over here and the body over there, but the whole picture. Sacred Arc is also personal for me because it reflects how I live now. My capacity is different. My tolerance is different. What feels nourishing versus draining is very clear to me now. And I needed a space that honored that, not just for myself, but for other people living in that same in-between. This isn't a space where grief has to be explained or justified. You don't have to prove that your loss was big enough. You don't have to be newly grieving. And you don't have to be falling apart to be here. Something changed you. If something rearranged your nervous system, your body, your sense of safety, this space is for you. Sacred Arc exists because grief doesn't ask permission. It shows up in the middle of your life, in the middle of your workday, the middle of your relationships, in the middle of your body. And pretending it doesn't exist doesn't make it go away. I wanted a place where grief could be honest, where you're allowed to say, this still hurts. Where you're allowed to say, I'm functioning, but I'm not okay. Where you're allowed to say, I don't know what healing looks like for me. And not have anyone rush you to an answer. Sacred Arc isn't here to give you a solution, it's here to give you space. And sometimes that's the most healing thing there is. Before I close this episode, I just want to slow things down for a moment. If you're listening to this and feeling a little unsettled or oddly seen, or quieter than when you started, that makes sense. This kind of conversation does that. And I want to be really clear about something. This podcast is not here how to tell you to heal faster. It's not here to give you timelines. It's not here to ask you to make meaning out of things that still hurt. There is no rush in this space. Sacred Arc exists because a lot of us are tired of being asked to move on before we feel ready, or before we even understand what changed inside of us. Sometimes the most honest thing you can say is, I don't know yet, and that's allowed here. If any part of this episode felt familiar, if you recognized yourself in the idea of the in-between or invisible grief or feeling strong when you don't actually feel okay, I want you to know you're not doing grief wrong. You're responding to something that mattered. You don't need to fix what you're feeling after listening to this. You don't need to journal about it. You don't need to reach any conclusions. You can just notice. Notice how your body feels. Notice what landed. Notice what didn't. Some episodes of Sacred Arc will be quieter. Some will go deeper into specific pieces, like the body, the skin, death, loss, the nervous system, or even shifts. You don't have to listen in order. You don't have to listen to all of them. You can take what's useful and leave the rest. If this felt like something you've been looking for, even if you couldn't name it before, you're in the right place. And if today isn't the day to keep listening, that's okay too. This space will be here when you're ready. This is Sacred Arc. Thank you for being here. I'll see you next time.